I have autism and I really like stroking soft and fluffy things like dressing gowns, and I like the look of them as well. This is a sensory thing, and I actually became really interested in microscopic hairs on gecko lizards. I then became really interested in hairy plants and hairy invertebrates. And I made art and fictional stories about the hairs on geckos, and then about hairy plants and hairy invertebrates. The hairs on geckos' feet called setae are microscopic. This means a special microscope called an electron microscope has to be used. Visible light is colourful, but the hairs are so small that visible light's wavelength is too big for the microscopic hairs. The resolution wouldn't be good enough. But if you use an electron microscope to fire electrons at the hairs, you can see the hairs better, just not in colour, like you would with visible light. I added an electron to the video because this video is like being viewed through an electron microscope, where everything is black and white. The gecko's tiny hairs, called setae, are very small, so I also added a mite and an amoeba to the video. You may ask, how do geckos' toe pads stay clean, and how are they able to be used multiple times? Setae ends help this. These beings live on geckos' toe pads and resemble the branched, tree-like and hair-like parts that they live amongst. Toe pads in geckos are thought to have evolved independently, and so setae ends may have evolved independently. A fantasy version of a partial or whole genome duplication may have led to setae turning into both setae and setae ends. Setae ends started out shorter with less branches. These setae ends had evolved diamond-like patterns like the early trees on Earth, called scale trees, that may increase the setae's surface area for possible friction enhancement or adhesion. These scale setae ends evolved taller sizes and more branches, although independently to modern setae ends. These early beings kept their diamond pattern like the early setae they lived amongst. As time progressed, technology for making gecko-inspired adhesives evolved, and some of these adhesives had hierarchical structures, like some gecko-inspired adhesives on Earth. Magic also progressed, and some of the artificial setae produced were turned into artificial setae ends. These magical beings help with artificial setae maintenance, helping the artificial adhesives be used multiple times, and they also protect the artificial setae. They fit together like Lego and can form towers in order to look out above the artificial setae for danger. The smaller parts on top of artificial setae ends can also become buds and form new setae ends. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Non-fiction. Geckos can have mechanoreceptors
called cutaneous sensilla. On these cutaneous sensilla there can be structures called bristles. Bristles can have structures on them called sutures, although I'm not aware of if any geckos possessing both although I'm not aware of if any geckos possess both sutures and setae. Arboreal geckos can have sutures, so maybe some geckos could hypothetically have both if they don't have them already. Fiction. The sutural people felt anxious. They didn't want to move their arms or even talk to each other in case they set off the mechanoreceptors. Whether this would actually have set the mechanoreceptor off was irrelevant. They were just worried about anything to do with setting off the mechanoreceptors. Then one sutural person had had enough. They sprouted legs and wanted to move to somewhere better. The other sutural people on the bristle followed, and they settled on the surface of setae like epiphytes. Like ivy, some became connected by a stem-like structure, or whatever that is on ivy, whereas others clumped together like moss. Hopefully the shapes of the sutures are relatively accurate and I haven't drawn something separate. Okay, thanks, I hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching. Female setae ants, based on ant wives. Female setae ants left the setae forests and they then cared for other protuberances on geckos. These protuberances on geckos can actually be antibacterial. The female setae ants gave these protuberances their antibacterial resin, which was healed and not repelled, like how water on geckos can be repelled. Some female setae ants branches face downwards and possibly have parts that can resemble berries. Some of the female setae ants weren't happy with the gender roles, but were discouraged from working in the setae forests of the adhesive toe pads, and so they set up their own adhesive pads on the tails of geckos, and that's why some geckos can actually have adhesive tail pads. This assumes adhesive toe pads are a prerequisite for adhesive tail pads. Geckos can actually have adhesive tail pads though. I also assume geckos with adhesive tail pads can have other protuberances which may make the gecko antibacterial. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. While setae ants may live on geckos' feet, beings like gecko barnacles may live in geckos' feet, in digital blood sinuses in the toes, which I think may support the melee. Gecko feet dinoflagellates may be found in digital blood sinuses, and mangrove setae may live below the surface of gecko feet with their roots projecting into the digital blood sinuses. Amphibious lizards may travel between the surface of gecko's feet and the digital sinuses within. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Warning talks about harm OCD. Geckos can have bumps on their skin, bump-like things on their skin called tubercles. Glyptodons are real fossil armadillo-like animals. Tubercle glyptodons now dwelled upon a gecko's surface. They extended their necks, ravaging the surface, in the process consuming the surface where there were mechanoreceptors called cutaneous sensilla and the mechanoreceptors bristles. The gecko was left less sensitive. Then, when the outer surface had been near devoured, a predator got a hold of the gecko. The gecko, not noticing this, didn't think much of it until it was too late, and the predator carried the gecko off. That gecko had no adhesive toe pads. However, tubercle glyptodons invaded another gecko with adhesive toe pads and setae. A group of a few of the creatures approached the gecko foot. The setae ants feared the worst, but plucked up the courage to save the setae. The setae ants felt they were nothing and had no purpose without the setae forests they tend to. Helping setae brought them great joy. Would the tubercle glyptodons take this all away? The setae ants poked the giants in the head and eyes with spears with thorns on the end, trying to get the creatures to stop. The creatures didn't understand and kept devouring the setae. The ivy-like setae epiphytes wanted to help the setae, as they knew the geckos and setae ants. The geckos and setae ants depended on them, but as well as possibly having mechanoreceptor themed OCD, where they worried about setting off the mechanoreceptors, they may have had harm OCD, where they worried they would harm beings. Harm OCD is a real theme in OCD. The setae epiphytes wanted to help the setae, but they were far removed from harming anything, and feared the thoughts of harming the creature, partly thinking if they thought it they might do it. They knew they had to act, and they knew what to do. Instead of poking the creatures with spears with thorns, because the setae epiphytes can resemble ivy, they wrapped around the creature's legs, like in Star Wars, stopping them from moving so the creatures wouldn't devour any more setae. The setae epiphytes didn't want to stress out the tubercle glyptodons, but just held on long enough for the setae ants to gather round and unpeel the tubercle glyptodons' feet so that they fell off. By this time female setae ants had arrived, and they helped lift the glyptodons off the gecko's toe pads. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Sleep disturbances may be linked with OCD, and glycine can help with sleep. When the tubercle-glyptodons ate some setae and some of the gecko's skin, in some places a beta layer became exposed. Beta layers are real layers in gecko's skin, and they can really contain glycine-rich proteins. The setae moss were the first beings to colonize the areas now without setae, like moss, in what's called ecological succession. These setae moss can be setae epiphytes and live on the setae like the setae ivy, with a large absence of other things to taste. The setae moss tasted some of the exposed beta layer, and the glycine-rich proteins in it helped them sleep. The setae moss decided they wanted to sleep, and when new skin and setae formed, they returned to the beta layer for more glycine-rich proteins. Some stayed in the beta layer, and they began to resemble more burrowing animals, and elongated, with their hind limbs becoming flap-like in appearance, like real limbless geckos. These beings were present in low numbers as to limit harm caused to the geckos. I'm not sure whether glycine eaters would have evolved multiple times on different geckos, with cuts or scrapes on their toe pads. I'm not sure how other parts and proteins would affect sleep, and I also assumed a new layer wouldn't cover the beta layer for a while, or until the gecko next shed, and I'm also not sure how glycine-rich the beta layer is as a whole. Maybe the glycine eaters are inspired by CM Koseman's All Tomorrows. Thanks, I hope you enjoy. In real mythology, serpent-like beings can encircle the earth, and beings can have their tail in their mouth. There's also a video about a so-called longest creature in Spore by the YouTube channel Bogboy. I'm not sure whether the beta layer in other parts of geckos contains glycine-rich proteins, but in other parts of the real geckos, I think the beta layer can be thick. Some glycine eaters may spread out to the beta layer of other parts of the gecko, possibly to dilute potential damage caused to the gecko. However, some glycine eaters may become longer and encircle the gecko while staying in the beta layer, if that's possible. If not, they may be at least partly in the beta layer. They may sometimes put their ends in their mouth. This may be a body-focused repetitive behavior, or BFRB. This real term can include hair pulling and skin picking in real life. I may have got the idea for this being from the YouTube video mentioned earlier. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. The gecko worlds were not just inhabited by beings. Gecko's skin can contain layers. In the fantasy world, in the group that includes geckos, faults like geological faults can occur on members of this group's skin. Geckos can shed more so in one piece, and so faults may be rare on geckos.
There is a tiny version of my pet rock living on the gecko.
The rock is sleeping in bed. Because the gecko's skin is like layers of rock, geckos have their own geology with tiny rocks made out of keratin. And keratin is just what skin is made out of. That's why there is a version of my pet rock made out of keratin living on the gecko.
There weren't just beams and geological features on the geckos. Real-life knobtail geckos can have round things at the end of their tails. In the fantasy world, these things are like stars with planets orbiting, possibly adding a cosmic dimension to the world. The geckos are still their regular size and live on the world just with miniature planets orbiting the tips of their tails. The inhabitants of the geckos may desire to explore the planets. I may change the colour of the gecko in the picture. In the beginning, the star on a gecko's tail was dimmer, and a darker shade coated the gecko, such as that of the knobtail gecko, Nephurus asper. Geckos can have cutaneous sensilla, which can be mechanoreceptors. Beings landed on the gecko. Nephurus asper in real life has bristles on cutaneous sensilla, which have been described as resembling maces. The beings that landed on the gecko picked up the bristles, possibly enchanting their properties, and fought each other with the mace-like bristles. The people on the bristles were forced to stay on them during the battles. Instead of having stars at the end of their tails, some knobtail gecko-like geckos have black holes at the end of their tails. Smaller geckos can also live on the gecko. The pull towards the black hole is stronger for the beings on the gecko closer to the black hole. The closer beings on the gecko are to the black hole, the larger their adhesive feet therefore are, in order to stay on the gecko and not be sucked into the black hole. Some geckos close to the black hole may have some of their feet closer to the black hole than their other feet. Their feet closest to the black hole are larger, as the force of gravity of the black hole may be stronger for those feet. Non-fiction. The sort of tree-like structures called setae on geckos' toe pads can have gaps between them. I think there may have been thought that sometimes there is air between setae in what's called a Cassie-Baxter state, but sometimes water can penetrate the gaps in what's called a Wenzel state. I'm not sure if these states occur under natural conditions and whether they are still thought to occur, because the gaps may be filled with air or water. In the story, both water and land, fictional creatures can inhabit geckos' toe pads. Fish called little skates in real life can push off sandy bottoms with pelvic fins. Fiction. In Gecko's toe pads, setae skates have toe pads where little skates' pelvic fins can be, and can roam the setae forests and can climb setae. Setae monkeys can climb the branches of the setae on Gecko's toe pads. In real life, some geckos may have lost adhesive toe pads. When some geckos lost their adhesive toe pads, setae primates had to stop living in tree-like setae and gradually turned into miniature humans. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. The beings that live on geckos and their toe pads can have their own toe pads in order to stay on the geckos. On these gecko dwellers' toe pads there can be smaller setae. These smaller setae can be called bonsai setae, and smaller beings living amongst those smaller setae. Those smaller beings can have their own toe pads with even smaller setae, and even smaller beings living amongst those setae. The cycle continues. In string theory, the universe is sort of made of strings. As the toe pads and their setae get smaller and smaller, they get so small that there becomes visible strings making up the setae. These setae are known as string setae. Although I think Gecko's toe pads may not self-adhere in real life, the smaller magical toe pads in the story can adhere to larger toe pad setae, but not to the toe pads of the same size as the smaller toe pads. I don't know if in real life the gaps between the setae would also be made of strings, but in the story you just see strings in the setae. Thanks, I hope you enjoy. Thanks. In the story there can be smaller geckos living on Gecko's toe pads. In the story, there can also be geckos larger than regular geckos, and some of these geckos are so large that individual setae are more visible to the naked eye, and they are also large enough for blood to flow through the setae. The setae together have an enormous surface area, and instead of the gecko using their feet for adhesion, the setae are used to supplement breathing and respiration. And the large surface area allows oxygen to flow in and carbon dioxide to exit. These geckos may still hyperextend their toes, meaning they peel their toes back from the surface, in this case, to get more oxygen to them. The blood inside setae gives them a pinkish red colour. Setae ends may be found amongst the blood-filled setae, and may also be filled with blood. The blood-filled setae ends may keep the setae moist and remove blood-sucking parasites from the setae, possibly in some cases to prevent the spread of diseases, although I'm not sure that would work in real life. Thanks. for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Parts of non-gecko organisms can also be called setae. Beetles can have mushroom-shaped setae in real life. Possibly before large trees were around, in real life there may have been giant fungi known as prototaxites. Maybe before tree-like Propacete and scale tree-like Propacete, there were towering mushroom setae known as Prototaxites setae. Smaller mushroom-shaped setae inhabited geckos later in the story, and some glowed like real bioluminescent fungi. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship, including fungi and algae or cyanobacteria. Some mushroom setae evolved a symbiotic relationship with setae epiphytes. Lichen can have cup-shaped fruiting bodies, and in Cladonia, trumpet-shaped parts. Lichen setae epiphytes can drink out of cups and play trumpets shaped like parts of Cladonia lichen. When they blow into the Cladonia trumpets, they disperse the spores. Some gecko setae forests on their toe pads contained relatively large branched protuberances that looked a bit like regular setae, but they were actually coral mushroom setae and evolved from mushroom setae and looked like coral fungi, which are real life fungi. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Real geckos can have what are called lateral digital tendons in their toes. These and their sort of branches can look a bit like appendages of radiodonts, which are real fossil animals that include Anomalocaris. The larvae of lateral digital tendon radiodonts make their way into the gecko's toes. Their appendages may replace the gecko's lateral digital tendons, and they may use magic to animate the gecko's foot. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. In real life, geckos can have things near the skeletal elements of their toes, known as paraphalanges or paraphalangeal elements. Paraphalanges in real life can be cartilaginous or bony, and in real life they may support things called scancers or webbing between toes. Scancers can be on geckos' toes. In the story, paraphalangeal elements can look like eyes and legs and feet. And in the story, these may be found in some geckos' feet or outside their feet. I'm not sure how adhesive the feet of the geckos are that these paraphalangeal elements in the story are based on, although I'm not sure what geckos' adipose cells look like. In other organisms they may look quite spherical. Waxworms eat lipids, and adipose cells can contain lipids. In real life, I think geckos may have adipose tissue in their feet, which may be cushioning. I think they're found in toes, In the story, miniature waxworms may eat lipids in the adipose tissue in gecko's feet. These insects, being young larvae, love playing amongst the possible adipose cell ball pit and can have dummies. I don't know if in real life organisms would be able to move freely between adipose cells. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. The information in this episode may not be specific to geckos, and so the fictional beings may or may not be found in gecko cells, and real geckos' feet may not adhere in the environments in this video. Motor proteins are found in real cells and can apparently be bound and unbound to filaments and move cargo along filaments and cells. In an animation, they can appear as though they're walking with feet. In the story, tiny motor geckos move cargo along filaments and cells using adhesive feet to adhere to the filament and cargo. Here's the fantasy being's frogolipids, whose hind limbs resemble depictions of the two tails coming off the heads of phospholipids. Like phospholipids, frogolipids can move around in cell membranes, and there can be two layers of them. Motor geckos may carry things with membranes, and frogolipids may be found amongst phospholipids in the membranes. Phospholipids may be found in geckos' footprints, and so fictional frogolipids may also be found in their footprints. The frogolipids may then explore their surroundings. Here's some non-fiction. In real life, geckos may use Van der Waals forces, but in real life they may also use other mechanisms for adhesion, which can be called capillary forces, acid-base interactions, and triboelectrification. I don't know that much about some of these mechanisms, and I'm not sure whether acid-base interactions and triboelectrification are related or can refer to the same things. Acid-base interactions can encompass hydrogen bonding, although I'm not sure whether hydrogen bonding is used as a mechanism for adhesion in geckos. What are referred to as polar head groups of lipids may be exposed at the surface of setae, though, and acid-base interactions may take place between them and the surface. Although I'm not sure whether head group is referring to phospholipids and or other lipids. This is interesting, as gecko feet can be hydrophobic, and it was previously hypothesized that non-polar lipid tails were exposed. So real geckos may use Van der Waals forces, capillary forces, and acid-base interactions, and geckos may use a combination of mechanisms for adhesion. Here's some fiction. In the story, some geckos use the Force to adhere to surfaces, as in the Force from Star Wars. In Star Wars, midichlorians may live in cells and may affect force abilities. In the gecko cells in the story, there can be midichlorians, like in Star Wars. Some geckos may use the Star Wars force in combination with other mechanisms, like Van der Waals forces. The large surface area of Gecko's city may give them a large area for the Star Wars force to act on, enhancing adhesion. Midichlorian people in the cells of geckos can resemble Jedis with robes and magical lightsaber-looking devices, and the midichlorian people may help produce the Star Wars force, helping some geckos to adhere to surfaces. With an extra force in the story, the maximum size geckos could reach and still adhere to surfaces increased. At least some midichlorian people may have eyebrows. Thanks, I hope you enjoy. Squamata is a real group that includes lizards and snakes, as well as cetaceans meant to resemble gecko setae. Other beings, called prong rabbits, are meant to resemble other real squamate protuberances, like prongs. Non-fiction. Setae can have spatulate tips, and spatulae can be triangular, and setae can be capable of adhesively supporting the whole body during static clinging and locomotion on vertical low friction surfaces. In our world, in the past, structures that might not be setae by this criteria have been called setae. Prongs can have blunt tips, but both setae and prongs can be branched. Prongs can also have flattened tips, and these have previously been called seta. Prong intermediates in ano lizards, which aren't geckos. Unlike protuberances called spinules, protuberances called spines, and prongs can be over 1 micrometer. Fiction. In the story, prong rabbits resemble rabbits, and the branches resemble the ears of rabbits. The drawing is based on a diagram of prongs and not a photo, and so the diagram may be too simplified. The information is also based on one Gecko paper, but a 2021 paper. Mandrakes are beings from Harry Potter. Setae mandrakes, parts above the gecko's surface, resemble gecko's protuberances. However, below the gecko's surface are humanoid-shaped parts of the beings. Setae mandrakes may be found on gecko's feet, which, like some real gecko's feet, can have shorter, so-called setae. These so-called setae may not meet a 2021 paper's criteria for setae. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. Parts of organisms that aren't geckos can get called setae as well. Algae, called diatoms, can have parts called setae. Diatoms can fuse setae together to form chains. Gecko setae may not self-adhere to each other In real life, according to one real paper, Gecko's Cete may have a positive charge. I think the possibility of the same charge may help prevent Cete from sticking together. I assume because like charges repel. I am not sure whether other factors affect Cete not self-adhering. Fiction. A bit like diatoms, gecko diatoms put their toe Cete together to form chains of gecko diatoms. Gecko diatoms don't necessarily live on or in geckos. Gecko diatoms can be quite small, and small gecko diatoms may be found in geckos' blood, sinuses and toes. The magical, possibly mini Cete in small gecko diatoms may have the same charge as other Cete on the same gecko diatom. This may help prevent their Cete sticking to other of their own Cete. Some gecko diatoms, however, have Cete that are positively charged, and some gecko diatoms have Cete that are negatively charged. This means while Cete on the same gecko diatoms don't necessarily stick together, Cete can adhere to differently charged Cete on other gecko diatoms. In this story, this allows gecko diatoms to form chains, although if there are other reasons gecko Cete don't self-adhere, this may not work, but I hope you still enjoyed. Thanks. Warning talks about harm-OCD. Geckos can have things called cutaneous sensilla, which can be mechanoreceptors. Cutaneous sensilla can have projections called bristles, and bristles can have projections on themselves. Previously, projections, like people on a gecko's cutaneous sensillum, left the bristle and settled on the Cete as epiphytes. Their descendants became Cete ivy, glycine eaters, and Cete lichen. In order to leave the bristle, they sprouted legs, but when they're on Cete, they don't have legs. Cete ants use equipment to clean the Cete, but they don't always carry equipment, so where do Cete epiphytes, legs, and Cete ants equipment go when they're not using them? They go to another dimension, the leg dimension. Usually beings could only travel from a leg dimension to one certain gecko. Something was happening. The leg dimensions from multiple geckos were becoming connected. Using the leg dimension, beings could now travel to other geckos. An army of demon protuberances came through the leg dimension and invaded the geckos. They had branches resembling horns. The gecko dwellers also travelled through the leg dimension to other geckos to help fight. Midichlorian people travelled from gecko cells to the surface. The midichlorian people thought there were more beings on the geckos than the invaders, and so justified harming the invaders. The midichlorian people swung their lightsaber-like devices and fought side by side with the Cete ants. Some midichlorian people stayed inside the gecko in case of any invaders inside the gecko, while on some geckos, female cetaceans may have since been allowed to be on the same toe pads as male cetaceans. On one gecko, only male cetaceans could be found on the toe pads, and the females weren't deemed worthy. The cetaceans were going to need help. Should we let the females help? Said one cetacean from the segregated gecko. Another cetacean from the same gecko replied with, "Not very ladylike." Some female cetaceans came anyway and joined the fight. Rhizines are real protuberances on lichen that can anchor them to a substrate. Some setae lichen projected into the setae like rhizines and hid there. There were bigger beings coming, like tubercle glyptodons. The larger beings were mind-controlled. Previously, like in Star Wars, setae ivy wrapped around tubercle glyptodons like ivy to stop them moving, and they were then peeled off the gecko. There was a whole army this time. More than just setae ivy were needed. Some glycine eaters that had previously became very long helped wrap around the beings. Gecko diatoms emerged from the blood of geckos like the blood sinuses in toes and linked toe pads once more. The carbon and diamond can form 4 bonds, and geckos can have 4 feet. The gecko diatoms encircled the beings and took on a diamond-like configuration that was hard to break. Although in real life, diamond may be hard, I'm not sure how tough it is. The setae ivy, long glycine eaters, and gecko diatoms helped hold the mind control beings, while others unpeeled them without harming them. More help was coming. Setae mandrakes weren't large enough to stun larger beings with their screams. Setae lichen can drink out of cups shaped like the fruiting bodies of lichen. The setae lichen's cups filled with a magical potion. The setae mandrakes were taken to other geckos, and the setae lichen gave the potion to the setae mandrakes. The setae mandrakes grew, and if they weren't already, they grew into proper setae, which met 2021 paper's criteria for setae. They had spatulate tips, and depending on how many of them there were, could collectively support the whole gecko on low friction vertical surfaces. The proper setae mandrakes still have branches. The proper setae mandrakes stunned the large beings, but their scream did not kill. A demon leader had appeared that was larger than the demon protuberances. The setae ivy, gecko diatoms, and long glycine eaters all wrapped around the large demon together and held it still. The proper setae mandrakes selectively tried to stun the demon with their screams, trying to help hold it still. The screams didn't appear to cause the being very much pain. If they unpeeled the demon would just harm other geckos. The Sete Ivy's ancestors, on a bristle, had OCD about setting the cutaneous sensillum off. The Sete Ivy had harm OCD and worried they would harm beings. Previously, they managed to not harm tubercle diptydons. They thought if they harmed the large demon, would it be a stepping stone towards harming other beings? But if they didn't harm the being, other beings that lived on and in the gecko would get harmed. If they killed the being, its mind control would cease, and the other beings would be saved. Was the being too strong to be sealed away? Did they have to harm it? They couldn't hold the demon for much longer. Were the Sete Mandrake's screams actually hurting the demon, and were the Sete Ivy helping facilitate that? The uncertainty of whether the Sete Ivy should help kill the demon may have affected the Sete Ivy. The Sete Ivy and Gecko diatoms may have stayed wrapped around the demon leader, helping hold them while the long glycinita constricted large demon to death. The Sete Ivy may have helped kill the demon. A being may have been killed because of them. How could this affect their mental health and harm OCD? The demon leader had been either sealed or killed, and the army retreated. But a gecko had been badly affected. The Sete were gone. The gecko may fall. Was this the end for the gecko dwellers? Sete lichen can have trumpets shaped like parts of Cladonia lichen. The Sete lichen blew into their Cladonia trumpets and summoned the worms. These were no regular worms, though. These were Nemertians. Nemertians are real worms that can have proboscises, which can appear branched. The worms came. They stood up on the gecko's feet, and their branched proboscises came out. The worms adhered to the surface the gecko was on. The gecko was saved. The worms had replaced the Sete using their proboscises. This part was inspired by Majora's Mask, a Legend of Zelda game. The proper Sete mandrakes had now turned back into their normal form, and the female Sete ants had proved themselves worthy. The female Sete ants were now allowed to work on the gecko's toe pads. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Warning talks about harm OCD. The demon leader was dead. The Sete Ivy were anxious. They had helped kill a being. If they stayed on the gecko, they thought they may harm other people. They decided they would leave the gecko and create their own organism with a barrier like a cell membrane or cell wall separating them from others. In order to create and maintain their own organism, they took on a new form. Themselves and the ivy, like thing connecting them, took on the form of a double helix, like in DNA. The new organism was photosynthesizing and didn't eat other organisms. Thanks. Non-fiction. Hopefully my drawings of spatulae are accurate in this video. Geckos and anole lizards can have protuberances called setae. Gecko setae can end in triangular and flat tips, which can be called spatulae. Anoles can also have spatulae tips. Anole setae can be unbranched with only one spatula tip, whereas gecko setae can be branched with multiple tips. In the story, living on gecko's feet and anole lizard's feet are spatulae Pikmin. These resemble Nintendo's Pikmin, but with spatulae tips instead of leaves. In real life, gecko spatulae can be 200 nanometers wide. I think, or about that, yeah. Whereas anole spatulae can apparently be over 3 times wider. In the story, because of this, anole Pikmin may be larger than gecko Pikmin. I may give some setae climbing gecko Pikmin tails. Like real compound leaves in the story, geckos can have compound spatulae on setae, although I'm not sure how effective that would be in real life. Spatulae clovers may be found on the setae forest floor of geckos. Spatulae people can live on the ends of setae and may help the gecko adhere to surfaces. Their facial features are sunken in and do not protrude, as I think that may interfere with adhesion. The holes may go straight through, so they can see in both directions. Some may study the surfaces geckos climb on, and may be fascinated by these surfaces. Hopefully I didn't copy off a similar being without realizing. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. Some gecko diatoms that don't live on geckos evolved adhesive tail pads like some real geckos. This meant they could now form 5 bonds. Geckos can have flattened and triangular tips on setae called spatulae. Some setae lichen took on a flattened appearance like lichen and resembled flattened spatulae tips. These setae lichen can be flat against a surface. On these spatulose setae lichen there are cup-shaped fruiting bodies. Some setae lichen became branched like real fruticose lichen with spatulae tips as well as cup-shaped fruiting bodies. Thanks. Warning talks about staring OCD. A pandemic swept the beings on a gecko. Gecko dwellers died, and to compensate, some of the gecko dwellers developed the ability to reproduce. This, however, led to new OCD themes. Staring OCD is a real OCD theme where people can worry they're staring at people out of the corner of their eyes or staring at people's privates. If someone says don't think of a pink elephant, the harder you try not to think of it, the more you may think of it. The same may be with staring OCD. The harder you try not to stare at people, the harder it is not to stare at them. People with this OCD don't want to stare at anyone, and straight people with it can stare at people of their same gender. The Site lichen didn't want to stare at anyone, but they worried they were. There were beings all around them they couldn't turn away, so that they went in their field of view. Some real geckos can lack eyelids, and so can Site lichen. This meant they couldn't close their eyes. The pandemic meant they didn't want to touch their face, and so couldn't cover their eyes. Real lichens can have protuberances that anchor them to a substrate called rhizines. The Site lichen projected into the Site and became the rhizine people. Other animals that aren't geckos can have cetaceans. In real life, high proportions of the elastic protein resin can be incorporated in the tips of adhesive ladybird setae. The tips of ladybird setae ants can be very elastic, and this allows them to stretch their head and tips of limbs a lot. In real life, there may be higher proportions of resin on one side of the setae as well, so this may complicate things. Thanks. In real life, geckos aren't the only inspiration for adhesives. There are endoparasitic worm-inspired adhesives. These worms can have a proboscis that swells. The worm-inspired adhesives use microneedles which have tips that swell, causing interlocking with tissue. In the story, adhesives like these were also created, however through magic they were animated. It was time for more testing with the microneedles. The microneedles were confused, not knowing what was going on, and afraid of the experimenter experimenting with them. A window was open. They expanded to a much larger size than they were supposed to, and floated out the window. Later, they created islands in the sky with enough expanding and adhesive feet touching the island at any one time to hold it up in the sky, possibly inspired by Octoroks and islands in the sky from The Legend of Zelda. Thanks, I hope you enjoy. Down-footed geckos. It's been 2 years since I started my gecko speculative biology project Specota. Thanks for your support. Here's a story based on a late 2019 concept. This concept may not work and I'll say why at the end. Light bombarded the desert, heat engulfed the air. The sand burned a warm hue, but a gecko walked across this sand, equipped for the challenge of the hot sand. This gecko's ancestors had tiny branched hair-like structures called setae on its toe pads. When this newer gecko's ancestors moved on to the hot sand, the geckos were active during the day when the sand may have been hotter and lived in a scorching region. The geckos were active during the day as to not compete with other geckos. Like Namib sand geckos, the geckos had webbed feet which helped with digging and not sinking into the sand. Because the geckos were exposed to hotter sand, the setae actually enlarged, becoming insulating structures. The structures were an insulating white and may also have prevented the geckos from leaving tracks. The setae may have retained its branch structure and ended up looking like birds insulating down. Why this may not work. I think clogging due to sand may stop the setae from trapping air, assuming setae can trap air. And this is why the concept may not work. The angle of the setae may also affect the trapping of air. I don't know if down is the optimum insulator, and also the gecko's setae may be good enough without looking exactly like down. Thanks for looking. I'm still happy with this concept, and hopefully you enjoyed the concept. Thanks. Warning: mentions slavery. In the magical world of cetaceans, unlike Earth, creatures could sometimes evolve with a goal in mind. Dust potentially clogging up setae wasn't a problem in the long term, and so down-like structures began to evolve from setae. The gecko's webbing between toes may have been magically supported by paraphalangeal people. I don't know if that would work though. The cetaceans also became more insulating, down-looking. However, cetaceans moving around moved air and prevented dead air from insulating the gecko's feet. The cetaceans therefore needed to remain still if they wanted to remain on the feet. The cetaceans acquired the ability to reproduce on their own and the magical ability of controlling wind. And the gecko's setae the ability to maintain itself. These down cetaceans then left the gecko and became independent. The down cetaceans enjoyed their new freedom. When looking back on their past, some of the down cetaceans thought of other cetaceans as enslaved. But because the other cetaceans couldn't survive without geckos, they saw their duty as a necessary evil. Some down cetaceans believed they were imbued with the purpose of finding a way of releasing the other cetaceans. For cetaceans, work was hard but they were still drawn to it, intoxicated. For down cetaceans, the flame to release other cetaceans settled down for a while until the advent of the artificial cetaceans that were developed to reproduce on their own. Their passion was reignited. If asked, some blood-filled cetaceans may have claimed they enjoyed working on geckos. However, some down cetaceans thought some cetaceans felt tired and stressed. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. Warning talks about staring OCD. The cetaceans were eventually set free. The setae may degenerate. What would happen to the gecko dwellers? In the real program, the future is wild. 200 million years in the future, lichen turns into lichen trees, which are tree-like in appearance. In the story, at the current point, some setae lichen had eventually turned into lichen tree setae. They resembled the sort of tree-like setae. They weren't as tall or as branched as some surrounding setae. They had some tips with spatulae on, and some tips with lichen cup-shaped fruiting bodies. The cup-shaped tips may have used suction. The cetaceans had been set free. Without the cetaceans, the setae degenerated. The lichen tree setae drank a potion out of their fruiting body-shaped cups. They grew taller and more branched. They reproduced, increasing their numbers, and replaced the setae. A gecko was saved. The rising people who worried about staring at other people could no longer hide in the setae. The lichen tree setae took the setae's place, but hiding in lichen tree setae was like staring at the lichen tree setae. The rising people had a choice. They could either move somewhere else, like underground, or face staring at people. The surface was the rising people's home. They couldn't look anywhere, and they couldn't live in their home. This was too much, and they decided they were just going to face staring at people. They stayed on the surface where people were around, and over time, their exposure to the worry lessened the anxiety. Their staring OCD lessened, and because they weren't trying so hard not to stare anymore, the staring lessened. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Real gecko setae can end in triangular and flat tips called spatulae. The cetaceans had gained the ability to leave the geckos and had left them. Later, other gecko dwellers gained this ability. Their potions had advanced. They drank potions out of the setae, lichens, lichen fruiting body-shaped cups, and enlarged, and became part of the larger world outside geckos. Some of the spatula-shaped setae lichen took on a form like real crustose lichen. Some setae ivy were enlarged and now dwelled on real trees, like real ivy. The setae may not have degenerated on every gecko. Some of the remaining old setae were enlarged and turned into trees, some with spatula-shaped leaves. Some of these spatula-shaped leaves could fall off in autumn or fall. Some large setae trees now resembled sequoias. Some of the gecko dwellers stayed on the geckos and kept the lichen tree setae company. In time, would even the lichen tree setae get replaced by regular setae that can maintain themselves? Regular people may also have become able to shrink down and be found on geckos. I had the concept that therapists would shrink themselves down and visit the gecko dwellers on the gecko. The therapist would then teach some of the gecko dwellers about their OCD. This is assuming the therapy was needed in this time period, and I'm not sure how likely it is people would want to shrink down if the world is technologically advanced and has simulations. Not just geckos can have parts called setae. Real-world pectinate setae can apparently have branches along one side at regular intervals. I don't know how accurate the picture is. In the story, pectinate setae were turned into ferns with branches along one side. Non-fiction. Frogs can have flat-topped, polygonal parts, like on their toe pads, which can be separated from others by channels. These flat tops can actually be composed of nanopillars. I wasn't entirely sure what the nanopillars look like. Fiction. In the story, the nanopillars get enlarged as well. They end up in a desert with cracked ground resembling the polygonal parts. They then live there and grow spines like cacti. They may cover themselves in a magical, selectively permeable material that holds water in. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.
My past therapist had yellow trousers, and when this therapist shrunk down to give the beings on the gecko therapy, their trousers were so bright and unique that they stayed yellow instead of being in black and white. You never normally see yellow trousers, let alone when everything is in black and white. The trousers' colours really stand out on the gecko. The colourful trousers are even more unique, different and quirky when shrunk down. That's why I like the trousers, because all other normal trousers are drab and dull compared to them, as if the rest of the trouser world was in black and white. I hope I don't sound creepy saying this.